speakers, Christian Albrecht is still in an important meeting. He told me so he will be joining us in a little while. And Dagmar has wind problems in Toronto, so the internet might not be as stable as possible. But anyway, so we proceed. We go to our first speaker, and then hopefully Dagmar will have solved her meteorological challenges in Toronto, and then Christian will join us a bit later. So let me start introducing Dr. Natascha Zaun to you, who's a professor in public policy and law at the Leuphana University Lüneburg in Germany. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Bremen. Before joining Leuphana University, she worked as an associate professor in migration studies at the LSE and as a research fellow in global refugee policies at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. Natascha's key areas of expertise cover European and global refugee, immigration and border policies and politics. She specialized in EU politics and public policy as well as international cooperation with a particular focus on refugees and migration. And you can tell, her latest book, EU Asylum Policy, the Role of Strong Regulating States, speaks very much to the subject of that we've started to approach here. And Natascha, looking again at your CV, I thought you would be a perfect candidate for joining us for the Borders and Globalization project for a little while, but that's something we can discuss on a different occasion. But you very much align with what we do here at the center all the way to the Canadian West Coast. So Natascha, I will introduce Dagmar after this, and then when it's her turn, maybe you can start us off with your initial thoughts, and then we move to Dagmar in a minute or so.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to join online today. That's very nice. And I'm also sorry not to have joined for the earlier sessions because also the topic sounded really, really interesting. So I'm basically going to make 3 statements about the EU asylum policies and the common European asylum system, as that's really my area of expertise. I'll start focusing basically on the kind of the nature of EU asylum law, and then move to the impact of populism, because I gather from the title of the workshop that that's also an important focus of the workshop. And then I'll come to the governance implications of the recent reform of the common European asylum system. Okay, starting with kind of the nature of EU asylum policies. EU asylum policies have been basically designed as redistributive policies from the start. The idea of Europeanization of asylum policies started really in the early mid 1990s, when a number of member states, especially Germany, Sweden, France, the Netherlands, received many refugees and migrants as a result of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and also the subsequent wars in Yugoslavia. And then these countries were looking for ways of basically redistributing asylum seekers that they received at the time as top destinations of these asylum seekers. And they identified 2 reasons being at kind of behind their reception of larger numbers of asylum seekers. The first was that they felt that other EU member states had less generous asylum standards. So one way to address the unequal distribution of asylum seekers was to have the harmonization of asylum policies. The second issue that they identified was the fact that perhaps some of the border countries had more porous borders, or the border countries of Schengen had more porous borders, and so that the response to this was the adoption of the Dublin initially Convention and then later Dublin regulations, with the view of really kind of allocating the responsibility to process asylum applications with those countries that had initially kind of let asylum seekers in because of the porous borders, right? With the idea of Dublin basically being, there are lots of criteria according to which asylum seekers can be redistributed, family ties in member states, but also quite importantly, the first country of entry principle. And that was obviously something that then would make kind of border countries more responsible. We can debate whether the redistribution did or did not work subsequently to these policies, but this is basically really what the 2000s to until 2012 first and second phase of the common European asylum system looked like, really having these policies, harmonization, similar standards to avoid basically secondary movements of asylum seekers. And that was mostly in times of relatively low political salience of the issue. So even though, redistribution was quite, and always is, a quite political issue, in the early 2000s, a lot of countries accepted policies that would eventually mean that they would have to take a lot more asylum seekers, again, especially the border countries, right, accepting something like the Dublin regulation. And yet at the time, it was not politicized at all, which is interesting. And then now coming to my second point, also on the role of populism, but also kind of really the politicization of the common European asylum system. 2015 hits, and now the issue is deeply politicized. And here we see a situation of, we have on the one hand the Central Eastern European member states, especially the so-called Visegrad 4, that's Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, that don't want any EU policy or any kind of further integration in this area. The Southern European member states that clearly want more solidarity. And then the Northwestern European member states that want better implementation of policies that are already there, but are also okay with more solidarity if it happens in exchange for better implementation. And what's really interesting in this context is that we also see, we for the first time have really several anti-immigrant populist governments in power across the EU. And these governments block EU policies, and some of them, I would argue, just really for the sake of it. So I've done some collaborative work with Ariadna Ripoll-Sauvent on this, where we looked at the reform of the Dublin 4 regulation, finding that really it has been blocked in 2018 because of strategic coalition of the Visegrad 4, the Central Eastern European member states, that did not want any solidarity or any distribution of refugees, and then Italy, which wanted basically more of this. All of them having populist governments. And we argue that particularly the case of Italy is really puzzling, because you would think that, Italy would benefit from further redistribution. They should be in favor of it. But basically, we found evidence for them to block this, just to prove the point that the EU is not able to deliver results, but that it's really weak and not able to help also Italy, which would then, prove the point of the Lega and confirm the narrative of a weak EU that's really kind of not functional. So you could argue, or we argue in the paper, that really parts of the so-called refugee crisis, especially the so-called disembarkation crisis of 2018, that's really a narrative crisis that's constructed. When you looked into the media in 2018 in the summer, you would think, okay, boats coming to Italy, that's a major thing. But at the time, even Italy, numbers of asylum seekers were dramatically declining in Italy. So this is, and interestingly, even discussed in the Italian media sometimes, it's a narrative that's constructed to mobilize Lega voters. So kind of the populists focusing on the supply side and how to mobilize voters. And again, quite interestingly, this argument was also made in the Italian newspapers. The interesting question, I guess, with regard to this is, now we have right in a change of government in Poland. Would that change negotiations if we had them today on the issue? Also Meloni, of course, Fratelli d'Italia, also populist, but she also has a different style, right? A different political style from Salvini. So the question would be, okay, would we have the same output? Would we have the same deadlock with these characters as well as we did with Salvini and the peace? For example, that's debatable, but I think there's this really interesting question. Okay, so how do changes in government affect EU policy making in such an area that's quite sensitive to populist pressures of the crisis reforms. And I think here, I mean, I've always been quite critical of what came out of the crisis reform in the sense that there's always deadlock and not a lot has happened. And I think that's also the general kind of resume that people take from the 2015 crisis and the reform since then. However, I think actually a lot has happened since 2015, and maybe it hasn't happened in a way that a lot of researchers like myself working in this area would have wanted to be, but we do see some governance changes that are quite interesting in this area. I mean, for one, Frontex has gained significant powers. We have now kind of joint risk assessments, which have really strengthened European border policies. We also, I mean, there's the work from Victoria Meissner, who has studied this quite intensively, and of course also the staffing, right, of Frontex. I mean, the actual operational staff that Frontex has now gained is quite impressive if you compare it to the situation before 2015. So there you do see some EU level capacity building, which many scholars would argue does not necessarily happen in such an area of core state power, right? The regulation of migration being a core state power because it's so central to sovereignty, an area where policymakers are not really happy to make sovereignty transfers to the EU. And there we see something like this really kind of more, a European border guard establishing. And in addition to that, also the EU Asylum Agency, I mean, that has, first of all, it has been created in 2021, so it's a new creation subsequent to the crisis. And it has been shown de facto to intervene in asylum decisions in some of the member states, especially, for example, in Greece and during the times of the hotspots. And also, I mean, there's a bit of literature looking into the implications also of the current reform in the context of the asylum and migration and management regulation, for example, suggesting that if really everything that's in this regulation is going to happen, for example, the shared country of origin information that's going to be also developed by the asylum agency, that's going to be quite something. So there's certainly a lot happening that's perhaps happening a bit more under the radar, but it's also more depoliticized perhaps today, and that's might be because to an extent asylum is still very much on the radar, but also not obviously like in 2015, and also with a different focus perhaps. But these things are also happening, and so you do see some, I guess, some first indications that there is a governance structure that's moving away from the purely regulatory approach, harmonization, towards a more EU capacity building approach, where some sovereignties are given to the EU that might develop further in an interesting way. Okay, I guess I'll leave it at that. I hope I kept my time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and opening our discussion, to the supranational arena, and how important it is to see the EU as a crucial actor of regulating and governing refugees, particularly migration. If you have a continent that is basically doing away with its internal borders, the notion of who comes in through the external borders of the EU plays so much more of an important role. So that's something here. It's interesting to convey to the Canadian public, how complex then policymaking becomes once you have these multi-level layers, right, in Europe's system of multi-level governance. I see, Kristen is about to join us, but we go now first to Professor Dagmar Sönneken, who is an associate professor in law and society at York University. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and has been a visiting scholar at the Center for European and International Aliens and Asylum Law at the University of Constance, Germany. So with a very strong record of doing comparative transatlantic research. And Dr. Sönneken's research focus on comparative public policy both in the EU and North America. I should also mention that Dagmar was a fellow here at the Center for Global Studies not so long ago, so we had the pleasure of having her here, and we hope to see you back at some stage, Dagmar. And Dr. Sönig is also, I should say, the editor-in-chief of Canada's Journal on Refugees. So Dagmar, I hope the wind cooperates now in Toronto, and we will be able to hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really scary because it's very, very windy and you can see the branches. And I thought that maybe, yeah, we'll see. If I disappear, I hopefully will be back and there's only a branch that touches some internet cable somewhere. Thank you, Oliver, for inviting me. I was able to listen to the end of the previous panel, and I think my remarks fit well with the second part of where the conversation was drifting there. The second part of the conversation I thought was going more towards, well, what are some of the promising ways of approaching the, as Oliver put it, politically thorny issues, what has worked and what has not worked. I was recently part of a Horizon 2020 grant, and part of the research I also presented
Are you? Yeah. Christian, can you hear us? What? Christian, we just had a technical issue with Dagmar, so she might have to come in. So could we come to you, Christian? I know you just come from a meeting, all the more. I'm very thankful that you could join us. Christian, let me introduce you very briefly, and then I hand it over to you. We've been now starting to look at the EU dimension of regulating, governing migration and refugees. And before we had a pretty intense discussion of Canadian and German approaches, to governing migration. Let me just introduce you briefly. So Dr. Christian Leubrecht, who's just joined us, is a class of 1965 distinguished professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal. He's the director of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations in the School of Public Policy at Queen's University, and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the Center for North American Prosperity and Security. You have a long list of distinguished placements as fellows across the globe. I should, however, highlight here the two recent books, or the one book that he wrote in 23 that is of immediate concern to what we've been discussing, which is entitled Security, Cooperation, and Governments, the Canada-United States Open Border Paradox. And Christian, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to talk a little bit about the border here in North America. We heard from Assad a little bit already. So could I hand it over to you?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm just looking for my PowerPoint to share here.
Okay, so we need to make you host, co-host, right? I think Leah's working on that. Okay, now you should be able to share.
Well, if I That's all right. I can't. It won't come out on my end here, so it's nothing on. Oh, hang on. Let me see. Let me see what we can do here. We'll give this sort of one go here. All right. Okay. All right, there we go. All right. Thanks for your patience with me. Sorry I couldn't join you earlier. You might be aware the government's taking $1 billion out of defense, and that's having significant second and third order effects. So, yeah. So this is a little sketch, I guess, that Victor Conrad shared with me some years ago. And I've liked using it ever since because I think it nicely encapsulates the conundrum that we face with people making their way to Europe and money and resources in ways that we would rather not, leaving the continent. And so I think it's the reason why I like to use it is in part because it, I think, gets us nicely at the way that our colleague Manuel Bruni-Jailly has sort of encapsulated the latest iteration of the Borders and Globalization project, the 21st Century Borders sort of challenge of that we have these static borders, but really the challenge is dealing with mobility, and that mobility is not particularly well captured by the institutions that we have. And so if you think of this from sort of a matching perspective, we're basically dealing with transnational flows using 19th century Westphalian institutions. That's sort of my encapsulation, not Emmanuel's. Emmanuel would have much more sophisticated ways of articulating that. And that, I think, leads then to rather problematic sort of misapprehensions about the challenge that's before us. So you might remember at the beginning of the Trump administration, our own prime minister coming out, and here's the quote from him that you can read, that apparently the migratory flows that we were seeing were somehow being caused by political changes in the United States. Of course, a rather apt statement, because we're bound to perhaps see more interesting political change in the United States later this year. And so what impact might that have on flows? But we then did a paper that some of you will be familiar with to demonstrate that actually in 2016 and consequently subsequent years, the bulk of flows had nothing to do with domestic changes within the United States and were largely driven by two other types of flows. One is people who were deliberately obtaining visas to the United States for the sole purpose of making their way to Canada, either because they were inadmissible to Canada or because the United States has a lot more consulates and embassies, so it's just easier to get a visa to the United States, because it's pretty hard, if you understand how the Canadian visa system works, just to show up where somebody might be able to issue you a visa in the world. And the other being the flows coming from Central America. Many of you will know that many Central American countries do not require visas for a lot of the individuals who present at the Canadian border. So if you can't get into the United States, you make your way to Central America and then up through the US. So all that to say is that I thought it was a rather unfortunate politicization and mischaracterization of what was actually transpiring at the border. But that might also be just a function of the fact that, I think it reflects on the level of knowledge by many of our political decision makers on these issues, and that this is inherently a highly complex issue that we're dealing with in the 21st century. So in the 8 minutes or whatever that I have left, this is sort of quickly what I want to walk you through. So, and I want to really also thank the KAS Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their ongoing support for these projects. Of course, Canada has long been, and I guess, an increasingly interesting country if you look at recent changes when it comes to immigration, visa, asylum policy, and the like, and that has generated significant interest in Germany and elsewhere. So I want to continue to thank them for their support. So here's, I think, the challenge that I think we have before us, that we faced with an international regime that was never designed for the world that we live in today, for two reasons. One is that the regime that we have today, as it was designed in the 1950s, was primarily designed for state actors that perpetrate violence against their own citizens. And what we actually then see today is that much of the violence is perpetrated on the one hand by non-state actors, and on the other hand, a lot of the flows for people is being caused by climate change and other sort of dimensions that really state actors in many ways have relatively little control over. The others, of course, that in the 1950s, nobody anticipated the ease of transportation. The assumption was that people would flee to a neighboring country. It was never assumed that that there would be the cost of transportation would come down so significantly and make it so relatively easily to find their way for people to find their way across the world. Now, if you play this forward, I think the reason why this is, I think, perhaps the most interesting challenge of the 21st century is, of course, the nice thing about demographics is you can project them forward, and they're the one variable in the social sciences you can project forward with a very high degree of reliability. Because of course the bulk, over half of the people who'll be on the planet in 40 years have already been born. We already know sort of how many children they have, and we have very good data on what percentage of people lives outside of their country of origin, where they were born, 3% roughly. That's been fairly consistent. But we're going to have 2.5 billion more people on the planet. Most of those are being born in the most unsustainably, climate-wise, economically, politically unsustainable places in the world. And so, you know, I think from my perspective, simply kind of saying, well, you know, whoever shows up is just, you know, that we just need to learn to live with these migratory patterns. That's probably not a politically workable solution if we want to maintain the democracy, the prosperity, the public safety that we all enjoy. And so then the challenge of how do we set ourselves up for sustainably if we have a regime that on the one hand was never designed for the sort of flows that we're seeing and the realities that we're facing, and on the other hand the demographic change that is to come. Because if you think we have a challenge today when it comes to governance challenge today, just play this ahead 25 years and 2.5 billion people, well, you know, that's a lot of people. But if you take 3% of those who then pick up you know, that's a significant addition to the number of people who are already looking for a new home in the world. Add to that transnational organized crime, the challenges of significant portion of migrant smuggling, and the significant portion of people who make their way into Canada who, at one way or another, paid people to provide passage and advice on how to get into Canada. This is not an insignificant problem. Guadalupe Correa Cabrera has a terrific article on this entitled Messengers of Justice, about how many of the people who are thinking that they're actually helping refugees in the United States are inadvertently aiding and abetting transnational organized crime and migrant smuggling. And so how do we disentangle these issues of criminality, but also humanitarian entitlements and humanitarian law and the like? And so this, of course, is creating all sorts of unintended consequences that we're well familiar with politically, economically. And here I always like to point to the assumptions that I think people make about the border. I think there's three basic assumptions that people make. One is that governments have control over who comes into a country and leaves a country, for that matter. The second is the assumption that people who show up in a country will integrate effectively into that country, and the third is that they will make a constructive contribution to that society. I think this is sort of the basic social contract on which we operate. How that contract plays out is very different in a country such as Canada or such as Germany. As I always point out, in Canada, there really is no such thing as an immigrant. They're only future Canadians, whereas, of course, European societies are still very sensitive to the issue of migration and still sort of a lot of it sort of trained on the idea that perhaps at least some of the people who are crossing borders will eventually return to their countries of origin. I think method matters when we talk about these things, because I'm very apprehensive about the term migrant. I think this is a rather dangerous term to use. I think it has been propagated by certain special interest groups that would like to see all people who somehow make their way across borders in the same light. And this is simply both legally and morally untrue, both in terms of domestic as well as international law. States have different legal obligations towards different types of people, and they have different moral obligations towards different types of people. And so to somehow pretend that anybody and everybody who shows up should be treated in the same way simply both defies the international regimes and the domestic regimes in place. And so my concern with the term migrant is that this has been used essentially as a way to sanitize the conversation that sort of creates sort of a common denominator for anybody who crosses a border, which I think is actually part of the problem when we then talk about governance, and which is why our governance systems are breaking down, because we are not effectively applying the terminology that is actually in place to ensure that those who deserve protections receive the protections, and those are who are effectively using the provisions in place as a way, as backdoor immigration, because they can't immigrate by other means. And that this is ultimately potentially undermining the sort of consensus that Western societies have when it comes to asylum seekers, refugee protections, and immigration. And so then the challenge that we have is ultimately one of how do we come to transnational arrangements when it comes to governance of these type of efforts. And there's actually some interesting elements that are at work here. So for instance, some of you may know that there's actually an immigration quasi-intelligence system that exists among partner democratic countries that tries to vet individuals who show up, many of whom, of course, present without proper papers and the like. There are now systems in place to try to make sure that people don't try to claim in different countries if they've already been assessed in a country. The problem is, of course, that the flow vastly exceeds the resources that are available for countries to do this sort of due diligence and at the same time meet their humanitarian obligations that they have to individuals. And when countries are unable to do that, then we ultimately run into political problems. And in 2015, and I'll close on that, our adversaries learned what happens when you can't get your governance act together. A million migrants to Germany that caused significant political dislocation that Germany and other European countries continue to live with. And if you're watching the tyrant in Moscow and his meddling in Africa, you'll have seen the expansion of Russian influence in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and in Niger, of course, already in the Central African Republic. One of the key objectives of that is simply to cause as much instability and uncertainty in those parts of the world as they can, because Russia knows that will stoke, that will drive migratory flows, and those migratory flows will then cause populist reaction and populist resentment. And so the reason why I finish on that is to point out that what happens in the foreign policy sphere and in the sphere of sort of regional stability or instability has very direct consequences for how we deal with matters on our borders. And so this is why our interest with my colleague Todd, with Emmanuel, and with several other people who are here has been around how do we actually make borders work, and how can we turn borders from a problem into spaces where we can create regimes where people can learn to exchange information effectively together, where we can build common institutions, and where we can build single collaborative efforts in order to try to deal with these challenges. We don't have it perfect, but I think there are many good examples of where we can see good emerging efforts to that effect. I would say the Canada and US border has been one of those over the last 25 years, given that there was relatively little cooperation, especially when it comes to security, even as little as 25, 30 years ago. Canada-US border has come a very long way. But it'll be very interesting to watch over the next year, because the current government has expended a lot of good faith in Washington, and you can see this by concerns that are expressed by US politicians with very serious consequences for Canadian prosperity and the Canada-US relationship if we cannot convince US politicians that Canada has their back and has their best interest at heart when it comes to the security of the United States, as well as who enters the United States, not just from the southern border, but in our case, from the northern border.
Helen, though, adding a lot of complexity to the issue in 12 minutes. So, there's lots of room for thought here, but we're going to come back to you in a second. We now would like to give Dagmar, if she has joined us, could you stop your PowerPoint, or you're sharing the screen, please, Christian, and then we'll see whether Dagmar is back on. Okay, Dagmar, you left us off when you talked about your experience in the Horizon grant. So maybe, if the weather permits, you can continue your line of thought here.
Yes, thank you very much. I realized that I was talking and then everybody was frozen when I was just talking about the two avenues that in the Wallner project that we were exploring that have traditionally worked, and that is the resettlement stream, and talking about the vulnerability of migrants in various contexts. And this leads me to the distinction that Christian just made in his presentation, that there's a legal obligation that states have. And so, since I know somebody in the audience said that they did not know so much about migration politics, so what I mean by resettlement is the selection of migrants overseas, and the selection criteria often prioritize people who are considered most vulnerable and for whom there is no durable solution otherwise. And that is often preferred by states in the global north because they get to pick and choose, and we can talk about the criticism there. There is a pre-screening mechanism that entirely occurs overseas. It often is outsourced to UNHCR in collaboration with the government visa offices. It often occurs in refugee camps, but because that process is a humanitarian process, there's no legal obligation to do so, and because it's highly symbolic, because it focuses on particular groups that are worthy of coming, that's why it has often worked, politically speaking. But of course, if we look at some of the numbers, most resettlement experts, of which I am actually not one, I just happened to arrive at the resettlement topic because it was something that was missing from the international project. And if you're interested in more details about the Norwegian-Canadian comparison, there is a chapter that's forthcoming in an edited volume that I'm happy to promote. But what we were really finding was that, because internationally speaking, some of you may know that only 1% of the people that are currently displaced actually get resettled through the resettlement process. So there is something with that. States can select, it's discretionary, it's humanitarian, it looks good, but there is still not enough uptake. And Natasha in her presentation already outlined some of the intrinsical problems at the EU level of putting governance structures into place. And the EU has its own conversation of persuading countries to take migrants and of distributing them. So there definitely is a governance issue in this respect. But there are countries outside of the European Union, such as Norway, and Sweden is, of course, also a comparative Scandinavian country that have historically, just like Canada and the United States, participated in resettlement. And if you know anything about resettlement and about Canada, you also know that the most popular option in the resettlement stream is the so-called private resettlement stream, also referred to as the community-based resettlement stream. And Norway is currently exploring a community-led resettlement stream, but has traditionally had a government-led resettlement stream. And this is important because the section of the earlier panel that I was able to attend talked quite a bit about integration and people that come and parallel societies being created. And what is, of course, the big accomplishment of the private resettlement program in Canada, and that's why there's uptake in the European Union, and there's also buy-in by the local communities, is that people in Canada that have come through the private resettlement stream have been more successful in integrating. They have a community of people surrounding them and not just government money, which is important because there was a conversation about people being integrated into the welfare streams. So people that come, of course, if you get into the weeds of this in Canada, in the private community settlement programs, they're usually already people who have connections in Canada. They have better language skills. Sometimes they also have better educational credentials. So from the original promise of resettlement, of taking the most vulnerable, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because I want to, if I have a minute left, talk about that as well. We really aren't resettling the most vulnerable. We're resettling people, at least in the Canadian stream, that already have connections to Canada. But that, of course, smoothes the integration process. It also changes the way that the community anchorship is at the local level. So it has the promise from the bottom-up perspective. And that's why the community-based programs are expanding across the European Union. The colleague who was here from Germany in the earlier panel, he and I have talked about some of the German private sponsorship models. So there are lots of experiments, but they're very small scale. And if you look at the numbers overall on resettlement, the question still is, why is it not possible to scale up resettlement in general? Because of course it's a discretionary program, and because the symbolism and how governments politically employ who they bring in often is much more important than the quantitative numbers. If you're interested in the numbers, resettlement has decreased from the 1980s, where it was 40% of humanitarian arrivals, to around 10% in the 2000s, according to a 2022 study. And of course, if you are interested also in the migrants that are considered more vulnerable, the evidence from Norway and Canada also shows that the people that come that are considered more vulnerable, they then consume more integration services. They take longer to enter the labor market because perhaps they're traumatized, they need counseling, their language skills may not be as good, they might have educational skills, but they might just not be ready to go there because they still have to recover from whatever happened to them. So that's, of course, the conundrum if you're thinking about the people that come as potential labor market contributors. And that was also the conversation in the earlier panel. And that, of course, is what politicians also have to deal with. They deal with the costs, they deal with the community buy-in. And in Norway and in Canada, the concept of vulnerable migrants has also been politicized in another way, and that is that there has been a selection of people beyond what UNHCR outlines. So if you're a woman, you're a single woman with children, you're elderly, you have medically complex needs, you're an LGBTQ individual, you have other disabilities. So some of what we would stereotypically imagine somebody's innate vulnerabilities might be. There are, of course, also situational vulnerabilities, but in Canada, as in Norway, on top of that, countries have added, for example, particularly vulnerable religious groups, and have then picked Christians and non-Muslim minorities. In Canada, this happened in preparation of the 2015 election in Canada. There was the Yazidi program that some of you may have heard about in Canada that also picked religious minorities in Canada and highlighted them. In Norway, there was talk about how Christians would be better integrated than Muslims because Norway was predominantly a Christian society. So that then led to problems, but the Norwegian government actually changed its mind and did not try to select Christian refugees on top, give them preference over Muslim migrants during the recent 2022 election changeover. So there is the bigger problem
period seems really bad in Toronto. So thank you to both of you, Patrick and Christian. I think you challenge us in terms of some fundamental ideas about governing migration, refugees, which, Christian, you put in, this was echoed in my initial remarks introducing this workshop, right? We operate based on a notion of the Westphalian state model of sovereign nation state that protect their borders. And, our responses are very much tied to a mechanism of regulating and governing migratory flows that no longer seems to be appropriate for the realities of the 21st century. And you could argue, Natasha, what the European Union has done is to think creatively through a kind of supernatural approach that, given the realities on the continent, needed to be put in place to account for real flows, where are the borders, how do you approach even issues of cross-border mobility in an entity that has done away with much of its internal borders? So Natasha, maybe start off with one question, then you can already start thinking about your questions in the room. Natasha, you said the European Union has depoliticized its approach, and maybe this is one of the counterintuitive mechanisms by which you can be more effective in terms of governance initiative. You try to remove it from the public eye and work on solutions that might be more effective. And in a way, that speaks to our whole concern about how does a particular politicization of the issue create an atmosphere in which you can't move forward altogether, right, in terms of effective and desirable policies. But according to your assessment, the EU seems to have moved away from having this politicized in the public realm and then trying to embark on its policy regime basically behind the back of the public, which creates its own challenges. But is this what you see happening at the European level in this field?
Yeah, I would even say that that was also one of the concerns that drove Europeanization in this area. Of course, I mean, I mentioned the kind of regulatory competition and that was going on in mid-90s. But I do agree. I mean, when you talk to policymakers, they also those that were really there kind of in the 90s, they would say that in the 90s, right, also the discourse was very much politicized in many European countries, especially in Germany. And moving the issue to the EU level would take it away from the perspective of voters and populist and radical right parties, such as, for example, the Republikaner in the early 90s. So that was definitely a reason. But then it's also quite interesting. I mean, 2015, I think, is a good example that kind of this depoliticization strategy did not happen, and that there are even some actors, again, I mean, I mentioned Salvini and the Lega, but also the Visegrad countries, right? Also Orban particularly has been using the issue of asylum and refugee redistribution, for example, to actually mobilize against the EU. And I think when you have these also often Eurosceptic actors that play these narratives quite strategically, then yeah, gets really complicated, right? I mean, when after the EU adopted the relocation decisions, and Orban was particularly not happy with kind of automatic relocation of asylum seekers from Italy and Greece in 2015. He started a referendum basically saying, oh, the EU wants to impose wants to send illegal immigrants to Hungary against the will of the government. Are you happy to have this? And of course, people in this referendum very much supported Orban. So kind of, yeah, I would say definitely, I think there's some reasons why the EU could be a very good venue to depoliticize. And part of this is that some of the debates are taken out of the domestic public eye and out of the political arena. And then also you have more kind of non-majoritarian institutions and decision makings, the European Commission. But if there are actors that actively politicize, then they can also use the EU venue to even amplify the perception of crisis.
Thank you, Natasha. Dagmar is back. So, Dagmar, you were just about to speak about a big problem, and then you were cut out. Maybe you can finish your thought, and then we can open it up to discussion here.
I think I'm just going to keep it brief because I think you got the gist of the conversation, and that is that I think politicians still continue to like resettlement, they like vulnerability, but if you go deep into they like the symbolism more, the selective nature of it more, and in the vulnerability category, then we get into financial conversations and questions about integration. But of course, if you only have 1% of people who have a chance for resettlement in the first place, people with higher resettlement needs deserve just as much a durable solution and a right to life that we do, and that should not be the obstacle. That's, of course, the moral argument. But the political argument is, of course, how can you make that salient and not just play games in terms of who we cherry pick more over others. And ultimately, it still leaves, as many scholars argue, the people who really are too vulnerable to resettle in those camps or in situations in danger. And that ultimately, since Christian again mentioned the legal and moral obligations, that should also not be the answer to the question, because there is, I think, a bigger question also about societies and transformation and what we should really be thinking about as policymakers. I think I'll leave it at that because I could go on a little bit more if there are questions, if the wind does not knock me out again. But I think conversations might be perhaps more interesting, then others can fill in case I disappear again. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dagmar. Could I open it up if you also those panels, if you want to comment on each other or here in the room or online, you could raise your hands virtually if you'd like, or even leave a message in the chat box. Good.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So hi, my question is on the regularization of irregular migrants. So, for example, in the United States, there's this trend of criminalizing undocumented entry, and so criminal law and also the immigration law starting to merge together. And so I wonder, what does the conversation look like in Canada and Europe on the legal pathways to irregular migrants for them to get like a status? And I guess every panelist can talk to this question.
Did you catch this? Was the audio okay? There's those pathways. Christian, you would like to address it?
Well, I'll start with something, and I'm sure then my colleagues will have much more exciting things to add to that. But look, the criminalization, the illegalization of migrants is largely a function of when politics fails. Right. So the US is a great example of what happens when you cannot achieve a political compromise on a working and sustainable system to deal constructively with people who cross borders, with migration, with immigration. And the US has tried since the 1980s to get a new compromise, and for a host of reasons that is not workable. But look, so we had I'll just give you like a quick personalized story. So maybe a decade ago, maybe a little bit more, the US consulate in Dallas emailed me and it's like, Christian, there's a bunch of people from the Texas Farm Bureau who are going to come to Kingston and they want to meet with you. And it's like, what in the world can I possibly offer to people like who are members of the Texas Farm Bureau? But so it turns out they have two very concrete challenges. One is that many of them own land right along the border, and they are prohibited by DHS from going onto their own land without escort from DHS, in part because you get fired on from the other side of the river and whatnot. But you can see how If you're owning land and your own government tells you you cannot go and farm that land without people from your government watching you while you farm that land, you might find that a little bit irritating. The other is that they were fully open about the fact that they all have to employ their farm labor illegally because there is no farm labor mechanism. So however poor or imperfect the Canadian mechanism might be, for instance, they were looking to Canada in terms of how do you actually, what are some of the Canadian models on the farm labor program? But this is not to defend the farm labor program. I know there's lots of sort of inchoate sort of aspects about it. But I would say this whole, we focus a lot on the illegalization, on the criminalization of migrants and so forth. But I actually thought the point of the politicization, depoliticization, this is really, I think, where the challenge for us lies, because if we can find, these are ultimately political problems that require effective political solutions. And look, for somebody who works in I guess the security and defense sort of infrastructure, I always point out there's no more ineffective and expensive solution than to securitize or criminalize the problem.
Can I just add, Oliver, to the question that there is some good news on this front, and that is that the Canadian provinces have now said that they're going to end immigration detention under some circumstances. Certain provinces are, but there seems to be an understanding in terms of this merging of criminal law and Canadian immigration detention. And I've had lots of students in my migration seminar that have wanted to write papers on this, that there is also a trend that realizes that this is not the way to detain people in provincial prisons. So there's an interesting, I think, policy light that went on at the provincial level. Federal level is maybe a different conversation, but there are trends that I think can surprise us, and I'm happy to share one of the news releases if you want to learn more about that, because that just has been happening in the last few weeks.
Thank you, Dagmar. Maybe drawn on Christian and posing a provocative question to Natasha here. Maybe what we've seen in the EU is the consensus has been, and the policy agenda has been determined by a securitization push, right? So Frontex, you addressed this. And Christian suggested, I think, an interesting way of arguing this. It indicates also policy failure, right? Because securitization is probably the most expensive and least effective way of dealing with cross-border mobility. So is what we see in the EU, kind of failure of previous attempts to come to a more productive way of regulating and dealing with a challenge, right? And then what they can agree on is set in Frontex and securitize the external borders, right? So that seems to be the EU agenda. And if you think about the upcoming elections to the European Parliament, that might be even going further down this road. So I'm not sure you want to comment on this from a perspective of the EU.
No, absolutely. I fully agree. I mean, really, Frontex was, I guess, one of the few issues that member states in the EU could agree on, right? This is something that the Visegrad countries that do not want to take additional or want to do anything really on asylum can agree on. So this is something everyone can agree on, and it has a lot to do with the fact that, in kind of the internal dimension or really responsibility sharing, right? Member states were not able to find a solution, and so the only thing you can really kind of agree on, the kind of lowest common denominator, is securitization. That's a good way to put it.
Have we provoked you enough, Christian? You unmuted yourself.
Yeah, but I think there's an addendum to that we often forget. There is a governance pattern that is emerging. And it's emerging. It started in Australia. It was picked up in the United States and is now very actively being propagated by the European Union, which is to push the challenge of the border essentially beyond the border. That is to say, to have people lodge their claims outside of the sovereign territories of the countries in which they would like their claims to be recognized. And of course, there's all sorts of political and moral sort of debates around that. But if we look at this purely from a sociological, from a governance perspective and a transnational governance sort of perspective, I think that seems to be the pattern that is emerging in a way to square that circle. If we cannot get internal agreement around political solution, the political solution seems to be, well, then again, not passing any ethical judgment whether this is the right or wrong thing to do, but the approach seems to be, whether it's Australia or the United States, if you look at the Mexicanization policy or the European Union, you harden the borders, but you afford people to lodge their claims and to lodge their claims from wherever they might find themselves. And that was the really interesting thing about the Biden policy, right? That you no longer have to make your way to the border in order to lodge your claims. And I think this is a really interesting experiment to watch, because I suspect we're going to see at the land border the same sort of phenomena that we've already seen at the maritime and at air borders, right? So if you're not a Canadian or an American, right, you have to fill in the enhanced travel authorization, which has made it very, very difficult. Now, there's still people who are able to game the system. Partially, we enable them to game the system by suspending visa requirements and so forth. But it's very hard to get into many parts of the world now by plane. And depending on geographically where you are, it's very difficult geographically to get to Australia or to get to Canada. Add to that the intelligence and so forth layers that we've put on top of that, with governments wanting to make sure that people don't show up by boat, that the European Union has now been learning from with regards to the Mediterranean. And so we're going to see those hardened measures, I think, also at the land border. And you can already see this in sort of the Trump discourse, but I think the Trump discourse unfortunately echoes where a lot of people are at when it comes to how they would like to deal with borders, which is basically to somehow, as you know, there's that famous Janet Reno sort of quote, right? That, show me a 50-foot wall and I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. So I'd love to hear what Dagmar, what Tasha, what Oliver, and what the rest of you in the room sort of think about sort of this development purely from a governance perspective. I think this is really interesting to watch.
Can I just comment on the Biden changes briefly? I think that's really an interesting one to watch, because people will not be stuck right at the border trying to cross, which is the whole point of trying to allow people to apply before they get to that point. And I think that has so much potential also to be scaled up in other circumstances. If you look at the Canadian requirements, for Afghanis, they had to be outside of Afghanistan before they could apply for some of the temporary forms. It's the same currently with people in Gaza. I mean, it's just terrible. They're stuck in there. They can't get out, but they have to be able to go outside before they can apply for some of these streams. And Canada has historically allowed people under certain circumstances to apply while they're still within that country. So the countries, as we've all talked about, have the discretion, the flexibility to not make people jump on those boats and to not have them go through the Darien Gap or whatever is profiled. And that's why the Biden initiative, I think the Biden policymakers recognize that, but it's such a small step in the American policy, because as Christian also illustrated, since the 1990s, the 1980s, if you've tried to reform your Immigration Act and you haven't been able to, then it's just a stopgap measure that, yes, maybe a few people under the new Biden changes were able to. I think the system even crashed. So they also weren't ready for the demand in that example. But I think there are so many categorizations and requirements that we could change that could make it easier. The paperwork could also be reduced so people wouldn't feel that they need to forge paperwork, because under some circumstances they might be eligible for something. And I think there's always the categories and thinking about what the pathways might be, because that goes back to human capital. And if people are so desperate to come, then I think they also are desperate to make a new life and they have potential, right? That's the human capital. We all have potential model. And I know I come off as like this big lefty, but I think it's important in the securitization dialogue to also emphasize the choices. And again, we're talking about the things that work. So the Biden initiative is trying to stop people from dying at the border. And that's really, I think, also something that the EU is trying to do with the agreements with certain countries that they are crafting, but they're also making deals with countries that we don't want to know what the processes in Libya will be like. And Natasha probably knows all about this, but at the same time, if there is more involvement and more flexibility in letting people apply, the vulnerability screening that I heard of after we completed our project is also one that's supposed to get implemented in EU offices overseas. So I think the question is, if you take it outside, does it just have to be a securitized wall, or can there actually be orderly processes if countries are willing? Because people, if they are so desperate to come, they have something to offer. That's just what I think we should not forget in, I think, this dialogue about fear of somebody taking something from somebody else that often comes up from the political right.
But Christian, I think your point there to suggest that there is a deterritorialization of the border in terms of administrative procedures of selecting and aiding people in need, let's say refugees, right? I think that is what we see. I think it speaks also to the broader big project here at the center that the border, although it's still the place where basically decisions are made who can cross, governing mobility. But I think in terms of legislative and administrative processes, we see a deterritorialization of the border, and with these centers, to establish on the African continent, the EU's idea to outsource and, in a way, remove those procedures from the territory of the EU. So that will be interesting new developments, but also, again, unintended consequences, I suppose, that we see evolving at the moment. Sarah,
I have a question, and it's for Christian. I noticed that a lot of the time when you were speaking, you were arguing that there was kind of like a danger for sustainability of borders. And I was wondering, like, sustainable for who? Because I feel like the sustainability that we're seeking in this discussion, from my understanding, is that sustainability of like the status quo, which I view as kind of a problematic discussion, especially when discussing decolonization, when discussing people that are asylum seekers, like their livelihoods and their lives. I was wondering if you could touch on that. Sustainability for who?
Natasha had her hand up before, so I want to make sure Natasha gets a word in before I answer.
I know, sorry, I also only had a question, so I'm happy to ask my question.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, Natasha, in a second. So Krista, the sustainability of borders, right? Or what is it at stake here, and for whom?
So I'll try to provide a non-political answer to this, right? And try to just a sociologically, I think, straightforward answer. So one is that within all communities, there's sort of an agreement of who does and who doesn't belong to communities. And the hallmark of a political community is that instead of that agreement being based on culture, language, religion, whatever it might be, that we've basically created a social contract. And I think there's sort of all countries, all sovereign territories, and those sovereign territories don't need to be just countries per se. Look at, for instance, indigenous reserves, where there's a certain social contract in terms of who does and doesn't belong to that community. Some of that is EMIC, it's defined by the community itself. Some of them is ETIC in terms of defined by the Indian Act in Canada and by other hallmarks. And so those communities ultimately, I think, there's sort of a fundamental sort of agreement, a political agreement of people who are accepted, under what conditions they can be accepted into that community, and so forth. And I'm deeply concerned that the trends that we are seeing are fundamentally undermining that social contract. That undermining that social contract is in part what drives the politicization, but also the popularization. So the sort of populist responses to people who feel that they're losing control of the political process and of the political agreement. The other sociological point to this is, of course, that anytime we talk about newcomers, of any sort of people crossing borders, we also make assumptions about how they will integrate into a community. And in Canada, those assumptions have always also been, there's also normative assumptions in terms of norms transfer. And so there's some concern about the extent to which there's effective norms transfer, linguistic transfer, and the like from present day communities. So if you look at sort of the success of the Canadian immigration story, is really a success of norms transfer, right? That people somehow showed up in their communities and they acquired whatever it is that made those communities successful without necessarily defending the values or so of that day into what was defined as success. But if you look at, for instance, patterns of language acquisition and the like, if you look at the increasing concentration of certain groups within census metropolitan areas and so forth, there's a serious, I think, concern about whether that model of normative socialization will continue to obtain, and what is required to ensure that we can maintain the sort of successes of the past going forward in the future. Because with the number of people and the sort of other attributes that people have, I'm not sure the current model is sustainable in the way it had been sustained in the past. Sorry, that's too long an answer. Over to my colleagues.
We're almost at the 1 o'clock mark, but if you had a last question to inspire our thoughts.
Yeah, just a quick question to actually both Dagmar and Christian. So for Dagmar, since you studied resettlement and you described that in the 80s there was much more resettlement than there is today, I was wondering what was different in the 80s? Is there anything that we can learn from? Like any, I don't know, why were countries more open then? And could there be a chance that anything like this happens again, that countries become more open? And then to Christian, you described at the beginning kind of how refugee law was not really fit to the current situation anymore. And I was wondering, I mean, and I'm aware it's a difficult question, so I don't expect a kind of very straightforward answer, but what would be a good and perhaps also a viable way to address this lack of fit of law, of the refugee regime, if you will, and the current situation? Would that be, I don't know, a legal reform, or using the laws that we have in a way that covers the new cases that we have? You mentioned non-state persecution, things like that. Yeah, would be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Right. Short answers, and then we wrap things up.
I have to think about that one because I always think you can't turn back time, but because there is the policy legacy business, so certain experiences pile up over top of other ones. And not being the resettlement expert, I have to really, I have to get back to you, Natasha, because I really don't know if there is something positive that can be learned, because I think there's so many factors. Also, what's going on the asylum front, because although countries don't, like, we would assume that one goes up and the other goes down. You probably know some of the studies that's not been the case. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer for that one, but I'm going to think about that one and get back to you, and leave the last word to Christian, because I know Oliver wants to be a good German and finish on time, I think.
No, definitely. That, in spite of migrating, that never leaves you. And Christian.
All I can say, Natasha, I would hate to have you as my prof, because you sure ask all the hard questions. My word, So like Dagmar, I think I'll take the, it's easy for me to be a critic. It's much harder to think about what the sustainability of the regime looks like. I just know that the current regime is not sustainable, and I think if we it'll require a compromise. We're not going to get a new regime, but I think what the European Union is doing, for instance, is fascinating to watch, because I think those developments are among the most interesting in the world.
And I think it just means we have to talk again so that we can be more creative in terms of what might work, and just have another session where we discuss, and then we can pick up Natasha's question and ask tough questions back, I think.
I think
Thank you for having me.
some tough questions, but thank you for very inspiring discussion and lots of food for thought. It's great to have you in spite of the challenges, meetings, weather, 9-hour time difference. So thank you very much for being here.